In the shadows of World War II, as the Nazi war machine tore through Europe, a force of unparalleled brutality followed in its wake. The Einsatzgruppen, these mobile killing squads formed under the direction of SS-Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich in 1941, were tasked with a singular, horrifying purpose to systematically exterminate Jews, Roma, and other undesirables in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe. Can you fathom the depths of depravity required to carry out such heinous acts? The Einsatzgruppen, numbering approximately 3,000 men, were responsible for the murders of over 1.3 million people between 1941 and 1945. These were not just numbers, they were mothers, fathers, children, and grandparents, each with a life, a story, and dreams that were brutally cut short. Picture the scene: a tranquil forest near Babi Yar, on the outskirts of Kiev, Ukraine. On September 29 and 30, 1941, Einsatzgruppe C, under the command of SS Brigadeführer Dr. Otto Rasch, massacred 33,771 Jews in just 2 days. Men, women, and children were stripped of their clothing, marched to the edge of a ravine, and mercilessly shot. The echoes of gunfire and the silence that followed would forever haunt this once peaceful place. As Simon Srebrenik, a survivor of the Chelmno extermination camp, haunting recollected, the gas van was a terrible sight. It was a large truck with a compartment in the back, and when the doors were opened, the bodies of the dead would fall out like logs of wood. This chilling testimony unveils the cold, calculated efficiency with which the Einsatzgruppen carried out their monstrous mission, a testament to the depths of human cruelty. Join us as we unravel the dark tapestry of the Einsatzgruppen's reign of terror, exposing the scars they left on the face of humanity. Welcome to the Diary of Julius Caesar. Architects of atrocity, the Einsatzgruppen and Aktion T4 in the shadows of the Third Reich. The Einsatzgruppen, meaning deployment groups, were formed under the direction of SS leader Reinhard Heydrich in 1939. Composed primarily of SS and police personnel, these units followed the Wehrmacht into Poland and later the Soviet Union. Their primary mission, as stated by Heydrich himself in a speech to SS officers on June 17, 1941, was to cleanse the occupied territories of undesirables. In practice, this translated to the merciless slaughter of men, women, and children, justified by the perverse ideology of racial supremacy. Einsatzgruppe A, led by SS Brigadeführer Walter Stahlecker, murdered approximately 220,000 people in the Baltic region, while Einsatzgruppe D, under the command of SS Gruppenführer Otto Ohlendorf, killed an estimated 90,000 in Crimea, Ukraine. As Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel solemnly declared, to forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. One of the most infamous Einsatzgruppen operations took place at Babi Yar, a ravine near Kiev, Ukraine. On September 29, 30, 1941, Einsatzgruppe C, along with local collaborators, massacred 33,771 Jews in just 2 days. Survivors recounted the harrowing scene. Victims stripped naked, herded to the edge of the ravine, and gunned down in cold blood. Dina Pronicheva, one of the few survivors of the massacre, recalled, "They were shooting at us, and people were falling down, either wounded or killed. I fell down as well, and I thought, this is the end." Similar atrocities occurred in Riga, Latvia, where Einsatzgruppe A murdered approximately 27,000 Jews in the Rumbula forest on November 30th and December 8th, 1941. This pattern repeated across Eastern Europe, with Einsatzgruppen and their collaborators murdering an estimated 2.2 million people, most of them Jews, by the spring of 1943. Parallel to the Einsatzgruppen's campaign of terror, the Aktion T4 program quietly carried out its own form of mass murder. Named after Tiergartenstrasse 4, the address of the program's coordinating office in Berlin, Aktion T4 began in October 1939 under the guise of mercy killings. Doctors and nurses at 6 killing centers across Germany and Austria, Bernburg, Brandenburg, Grafenegg, Hadamar, Hartheim and Sonnenstein, administered lethal injections or gassed patients with carbon monoxide under the pretext of treatment. Among the victims were individuals with physical and mental disabilities, psychiatric patients, and those deemed incurable by the Nazi state. The program's chief organizer, SS-Obergruppenführer Victor Brack, coldly asserted, "The idea is unbearable to me that the best, the flower of our youth, must lose its life at the front in order that feeble-minded and irresponsible, asocial elements can have a secure existence in the asylum." One of the first victims of Aktion T4 was a disabled infant named Gerhard Kretschmar. In 1939, Kretschmar's parents petitioned Hitler to end their child's life, which they considered meaningless. Hitler dispatched his personal physician, Karl Brandt, to assess the case. Brandt authorized the infant's death by lethal injection, setting a chilling precedent for the program's future. Other notable figures in Aktion T4 included the psychiatrist Professor Werner Haider, who served as the program's medical director, and the nurses Irmgard Huber and Friederike Pusch, who administered lethal injections at the Hadamar killing center. By August 1941, when public outcry forced the official end of Aktion T4, an estimated 70,000 individuals had been murdered. However, the killings continued covertly until the end of the war, claiming up to 250,000 lives. The Einsatzgruppen and Aktion T4 were not independent operations, but rather interconnected elements of the Nazi extermination machine. Personnel from Aktion T4, including physicians and gas chamber operators, were later transferred to the death camps of Aktion Reinhard, Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka, where they applied their murderous expertise on an even greater scale. Christian Wirth, a key figure in Aktion T4, became the inspector of the Aktion Reinhard camps, overseeing the murder of approximately 1.5 million Jews. The gassing technology developed for Aktion T4, such as the use of carbon monoxide and the design of gas chambers disguised as showers, became the blueprint for the industrialized mass murder at Auschwitz-Birkenau and other concentration and extermination camps. As SS physician Friedrich Meinecke chillingly wrote in a letter to his wife, "The day before yesterday I gassed the first transport from the Reich. I'll write you all about it soon." From bullets to gas, the Einsatzgruppen's deadly evolution. As the Nazi war machine tore through Eastern Europe, leaving a trail of destruction and death in its wake, the Einsatzgruppen, the notorious SS killing squads, found themselves facing a daunting challenge. The sheer scale of the slaughter they had been tasked with carrying out was taking a heavy toll on both their resources and their men. The logistics of killing so many people day after day with bullets and rifles were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. It was clear that a new, more efficient method of murder was needed. As SS-Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, one of the architects of the Holocaust, put it in a meeting with Einsatzgruppen leaders in the summer of 1941, "The Führer has ordered the physical extermination of the Jews. This is a difficult task, which requires a great deal of hard work and dedication, but it is a task that must be carried out, for the future of our race depends on it." The answer to this problem came in the form of gas vans, mobile killing chambers that would become a terrifying symbol of the Einsatzgruppen's brutality. These specially designed vehicles, with airtight compartments and exhaust pipes that could be redirected inside, allowed the killers to murder their victims without ever having to look them in the eye. It was a cold, impersonal way to take a life, and it would prove to be a crucial step in the Einsatzgruppen's transition from bullets to gas. One of the pioneers of this new killing method was SS Hauptsturmführer Dr. August Becker, a chemist who had previously worked on the T4 euthanasia program. In a letter to his wife in May 1942, Becker described the gas vans as a good method to accelerate the process without putting too much strain on our men. The first experimental use of gas vans by the Einsatzgruppen took place in the Soviet Union in late 1941. In the city of Poltava, a group of mentally ill patients from a nearby hospital were loaded into a van and driven to a remote location. There, the exhaust pipes were attached to the compartment, and the engine was left running until all inside were dead. It was a crude, makeshift method of killing, but it proved to be effective. As one Einsatzgruppen member later recalled, the screams of those being gassed were clearly audible, but the sound of the engine drowned them out. Word of this new killing method soon spread among the Einsatzgruppen, and it wasn't long before gas vans were being used more widely. In the first half of 1942, as the pace of the killing increased, the vans became a common sight in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. They were used to murder Jews, Roma, and other undesirables in a variety of locations, from the forests of Belarus to the streets of Kiev. In the city of Minsk, for example, a special Einsatzgruppen unit known as Einsatzkommando 8 used gas vans to murder over 15,000 Jews in just a few months. The commander of the unit, SS-Obergruppenführer Dr. Otto Bradfisch, later testified that the gas vans were a more humane method of killing than shooting. One of the most notorious examples of the Einsatzgruppen's use of gas vans took place in the Chelmno extermination camp in Poland. Between December 1941 and March 1943, as many as 200,000 people, most of them Jews, were murdered in the camp's gas vans. The victims were told they were being taken to work camps, but instead they were loaded into the vans and driven to a nearby forest where they were gassed with carbon monoxide. The bodies were then dumped in mass graves or burned in open-air pits. The gas vans used by the Einsatzgruppen were typically converted trucks or vans with airtight compartments that could hold between 30 and 50 people at a time. The exhaust pipes were fitted with valves that could be opened or closed, allowing the gas to be directed into the compartment. Some of the vans even had a viewing window so that the killers could watch their victims die. As one Einsatzgruppen member later testified, the back doors of the van were opened and the bodies of the gassed persons were thrown out. The corpses were covered with vomit and excrement. It was a terrible sight. The gas vans were a fiendishly efficient killing machine, capable of murdering hundreds of people in a single day. The use of gas vans by the Einsatzgruppen was a significant step in the evolution of the Holocaust. It marked a shift away from the retail killing of individuals and small groups and towards the wholesale murder of entire populations. It also set the stage for the creation of the extermination camps, where gas chambers would be used to kill millions of people in a matter of months. As SS-Obergruppenführer Walter Rauff, the head of the Einsatzgruppen's technical department, later admitted, the gas vans were a transitional stage between the shooting of Jews and the large-scale gassing in the extermination camps. But the gas vans were not without their problems. They were often unreliable, breaking down frequently, and requiring constant maintenance. They were also conspicuous, attracting attention from locals who could hear the screams of the victims inside, and perhaps most significantly, they did not completely solve the problem of the psychological toll that mass killing took on the perpetrators. As the Einsatzgruppen member, Kurt Werner, later admitted, the gas vans were not a pleasant thing. The screaming and pleading of the people was terrible. It was much easier to shoot them. This sentiment was echoed by many other Einsatzgruppen members, who found the impersonal nature of the gas vans to be even more disturbing than the brutal intimacy of shooting their victims at close range. As SS-Obergruppenführer Rudolf Hoss, the commandant of Auschwitz, later wrote in his memoirs, the use of gas vans was not a suitable method for carrying out the mass extermination. The vans were too small, and the gas took too long to kill. It was a terrible ordeal for the victims and for the men who had to unload the bodies. Despite these drawbacks, the gas vans remained in use by the Einsatzgruppen throughout the war. They were a crucial tool in the Nazi regime's campaign of genocide, and they played a significant role in the murder of over 1 million people in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. In the words of SS-Obergruppenführer Friedrich Jeckeln, the commander of one of the Einsatzgruppen units, the gas vans were a necessary evil. They allowed us to carry out our task more efficiently and with less strain on our men, but they were still an evil, and we knew it. Shadows of hatred, the Einsatzgruppen's reign of terror in occupied Poland. As the dawn broke on September 1st, 1939, the world held its breath as German forces surged across the Polish border, marking the beginning of World War II. In the wake of the advancing Wehrmacht, a sinister force followed closely behind, tasked with a mission of unimaginable cruelty and brutality. These were the Einsatzgruppen, the SS death squads whose very existence would come to epitomize the depths of human depravity. As historian Richard Rhodes aptly described, the Einsatzgruppen were the vanguard of the Holocaust, the first step in the Nazis' attempt to erase the Jewish people from the face of the earth. Their primary objective was to eliminate potential threats to German rule in the occupied territories, particularly focusing on the intelligentsia, clergy, and Jewish population. As SS-Obergruppenführer Werner Best coldly stated, the Poles will be destroyed as a nation, only their manpower will remain. This chilling sentiment was echoed by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, who declared in a speech to his subordinates on October 4, 1943, "We had the moral right, we had the duty to our people, to destroy this people which wanted to destroy us." In the early days of the invasion, Einsatzgruppe ZBV, zur besonderen Verwendung, for special tasks, operated in the Pomeranian and Greater Poland regions. Led by SS-Sturmbannführer Udo von Voisch, this unit carried out mass executions of Polish civilians, including 26 disabled patients from a psychiatric hospital in Kochborowo on September 22, 1939. This act of wanton cruelty foreshadowed the atrocities that would follow. Another early atrocity occurred in the town of Częstochowa, where Einsatzgruppe II, under the command of SS-Obersturmbannführer Emanuel Schaefer, executed approximately 990 Polish civilians and Jews between September 4 and 7, 1939. As the German army advanced deeper into Poland, the Einsatzgruppen's reign of terror intensified. In the city of Bydgoszcz, Einsatzgruppe IV, under the command of SS Brigadeführer Lothar Beutel, participated in the mass execution of approximately 10,000 Polish civilians between September and November 1939. The victims, many of them prominent members of the community, were rounded up and shot in the nearby Forden Valley, their bodies unceremoniously dumped into mass graves. One survivor, Marian Ryjowski, a Polish mathematician who had helped crack the Enigma code, narrowly escaped execution by the Einsatzgruppen in Bydgoszcz, later recounting, "I saw with my own eyes the murder of several thousand innocent people." One of the most notorious Einsatzgruppen commanders in Poland was SS Standartenführer Josef Albert Meisinger, known as the Butcher of Warsaw. Meisinger's unit, Einsatzgruppe IV, was responsible for the murder of thousands of Polish Jews, intellectuals, and political leaders in the capital city. In a chilling display of callousness, Meisinger reportedly boasted, "We shall go down in history as the greatest mass murderers of all time." Among Meisinger's victims was the renowned Polish historian Marceli Handelsman, who was arrested and executed by the Einsatzgruppen on March 20, 1940. The atrocities committed by the Einsatzgruppen were not limited to mass executions. They also played a crucial role in the establishment of Jewish ghettos, such as the infamous Warsaw Ghetto, where over 400,000 Jews were confined in squalid and inhumane conditions. The Einsatzgruppen, along with other SS units, were responsible for the brutal liquidation of these ghettos, deporting the inhabitants to concentration and extermination camps. In the Lublin ghetto, Einsatzgruppe ZBV, under the command of SS Brigadeführer Otto Rasch, oversaw the deportation of approximately 26,000 Jews to the Belzec extermination camp in March 1942. One of the most harrowing accounts of the Einsatzgruppen's brutality in Poland comes from the memoir of Władysław Szpilman, a Polish Jewish pianist whose experiences were immortalized in the film The Pianist. Szpilman recounted the horror of witnessing an Einsatzgruppen execution in the Warsaw ghetto. "I saw a Jewish policeman slowly walk up to a woman who was screaming and gesticulating. He raised his arm, holding a rubber truncheon, and brought it down heavily on the screaming woman's head." The impact of the Einsatzgruppen's actions in Poland cannot be overstated. By the end of the German occupation in 1945, an estimated 3 million Polish Jews and 1.8 million non-Jewish Poles had been killed. The Einsatzgruppen's ruthless efficiency and unwavering commitment to the Nazi ideology of racial superiority set a terrifying precedent for the atrocities that would follow as the war progressed. As Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel solemnly observed, "The executioner always kills twice, the second time through silence." Harbingers of horror, the Einsatzgruppen's prelude to Operation Barbarossa. In the spring of 1941, as the Nazi war machine turned its gaze eastward, a sinister force was being assembled in the shadows. While the Wehrmacht made its final preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, another group was being readied to follow in their wake. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads, tasked with enacting Hitler's brutal vision of racial purification and ideological domination. As SS-Obergruppenführer Werner Best, one of the architects of the Einsatzgruppen, chillingly declared, "The Einsatzgruppen have the mission to protect the rear of the troops by eliminating partisans, saboteurs, terrorists, and above all, political and racial enemies." Heydrich, a man whose very name would become synonymous with Nazi brutality, saw the impending invasion as an opportunity to put into practice the regime's most radical policies. As he stated in a speech to the Einsatzgruppen leaders on June 17, 1941, just days before the invasion, "The Führer has ordered the physical extermination of the Jews." This fateful meeting, held at the Prince Albrechtstrasse headquarters of the RSHA in Berlin, set the stage for the horrors that would follow. The Einsatzgruppen were divided into 4 main units, A, B, C, and D, each assigned to follow a specific German army group into the Soviet Union. Einsatzgruppe A, commanded by SS Brigadeführer Franz Walter Stahlecker, was tasked with operating in the Baltic states and northern Russia. Einsatzgruppe B, led by SS Brigadeführer Arthur Neber, would focus on the central region, including Belarus and the Moscow area. Einsatzgruppe C, under the command of SS Gruppenführer Otto Rasch, was assigned to northern and central Ukraine, while Einsatzgruppe D, led by SS Gruppenführer Otto Ohlendorf, would operate in southern Ukraine, Crimea, and the Caucasus. Each Einsatzgruppe was further divided into smaller units called Sonderkommandos and Einsatzkommandos, allowing them to cover more ground and carry out their deadly work with ruthless efficiency. As the date of the invasion drew near, the Einsatzgruppen leaders gathered their men and equipment. Many of these men were drawn from the ranks of the SS, the SD, Sicherheitsdienst or Security Service, and the Gestapo. Others were recruited from the regular police forces and the Waffen-SS. They were indoctrinated with Nazi ideology, which portrayed the Jews and other undesirables as subhuman threats to the Aryan race. The Einsatzgruppen were to be the vanguard of the Holocaust, the first wave of killers in what would become a systematic campaign of genocide. To prepare for their grim task, they were equipped with an array of weapons, including pistols, rifles, machine guns, and even gas vans, specially modified vehicles that could be used as mobile gas chambers. The men were also issued maps and lists of potential targets, including Jewish communities, Communist Party members, and Soviet officials. One such list, compiled by the RSHA and distributed to the Einsatzgruppen leaders, identified over 1,000 Jewish communities in the Soviet Union, providing a chilling blueprint for the massacres to come. One of the most infamous pre-invasion meetings took place on June 17, 1941, at the Prelude training camp near Leipzig. There, the Einsatzgruppen leaders were briefed by Heydrich himself, on the nature of their mission. According to SS-Obergruppenführer Walter Blum, who attended the meeting, Heydrich made it clear that the Einsatzgruppen were to cleanse the occupied territories of Jews and other perceived enemies. He said that the methods to be employed were shooting and gassing, Blum later testified. This meeting, which lasted for several days, also included presentations by other high-ranking SS officials, such as SS Standartenführer Rudolf Lange, who would go on to oversee the massacre of tens of thousands of Jews in Latvia. These early massacres were just the beginning of a campaign of terror that would claim the lives of over 1.5 million Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and others. The Einsatzgruppen's methods were brutally efficient, with victims rounded up, forced to dig their own graves, and then shot en masse. The killers often took photographs and wrote reports documenting their grim work, providing a chilling record of the Holocaust's early stages. One such report, written by Einsatzgruppe, a commander Franz Walter Stahlecker, on October 15, 1941, coldly stated, "The sum total of the Jews liquidated in Lithuania amounts to 71,105. As Einsatzgruppe B commander Arthur Neber later wrote in a letter to his wife, "During the first weeks, I had to participate in the shooting of Jews and other unpleasant tasks. But now we are so hardened that such things do not affect us anymore." This callous indifference to human suffering would come to characterize the Einsatzgruppen's actions throughout the war, as they played a central role in the Nazis' genocidal plans. By the end of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had murdered over 500,000 Jews, a staggering figure that would only continue to grow in the months and years that followed. One of the most poignant reflections on the Einsatzgruppen's role in the Holocaust comes from Elie Wiesel, the renowned author and Holocaust survivor. In his memoir Night, Wiesel writes, "Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, that turned my life into one long night, 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky." These words serve as a powerful reminder of the immense human cost of the Einsatzgruppen's actions and the enduring trauma inflicted upon their victims and survivors. Rivers of blood, the Einsatzgruppen's reign of terror in the Soviet Union. As the German Wehrmacht swept across the Soviet border in the summer of 1941, a wave of terror and destruction followed in its wake. As SS-Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the Reich Security Main Office and one of the architects of the Holocaust, chillingly declared, "The Einsatzgruppen are called upon to fulfill a repulsive duty, but this is a task which must be carried out." The Einsatzgruppen's reign of terror began in the early days of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union that commenced on June 22, 1941. Within hours of crossing the border, Einsatzgruppe A, led by SS Brigadeführer Franz Walter Stahlecker, began rounding up and executing Jews in the Lithuanian city of Kaunas. Over the course of several days, Stahlecker's men, aided by Lithuanian collaborators, murdered thousands of Jews in the 7th Fort, a 19th century Tsarist fortification on the outskirts of the city. This massacre, known as the Kaunas pogrom, set a horrifying precedent for the atrocities that would follow. As Stahlecker himself reported to his superiors in Berlin, the goal of cleansing Kaunas of Jews was achieved in collaboration with selected units of partisans on the night of June 25, 26. Approximately 1,500 Jews were eliminated. As the German army pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the Einsatzgruppen followed close behind, leaving a trail of carnage in their wake. In the Ukrainian city of Kamyanets-Podilsky, Einsatzgruppe C, under the command of SS-Gruppenführer Otto Rasch, carried out one of the largest single massacres of the Holocaust. Between August 27 and 28, 1941, Rasch's men, along with Ukrainian collaborators, murdered over 23,000 Jews in a series of mass shootings on the outskirts of the city. The victims, who had been rounded up and forced to march to the killing site, were shot and dumped into mass graves, their bodies left to rot in the summer heat. One survivor of the massacre, a young woman named Manja Feldman, later recalled, "We were forced to strip naked and climb into the pit. People were screaming, crying, begging for their lives. The shots rang out and bodies fell on top of me. I lay there, pretending to be dead, until nightfall." The massacres at Kaunas and Kamianets-Podilsky were just the beginning of the Einsatzgruppen's campaign of terror. As the German army advanced towards Moscow, the killing squads followed in its wake, murdering Jews and other perceived enemies with ruthless efficiency. In the Belarusian capital of Minsk, Einsatzgruppe B, led by SS Brigadeführer Arthur Niebuhr, oversaw the murder of over 20,000 Jews in the first months of the occupation. The killings took place in the nearby village of Mali Trostenets, where victims were shot and dumped into mass graves or gassed in specially modified vans known as gas wagons. As Niebuhr himself later testified during his war crimes trial, "The executions were carried out under my responsibility and according to my directives." The gas wagons, which had been developed by the SS as a more efficient means of killing, became a key tool in the Einsatzgruppen's arsenal of death. In the Ukrainian city of Kharkov, Einsatzgruppe C used gas wagons to murder over 10,000 Jews and Soviet prisoners of war in the winter of 1941 to 1942. The victims, who had been rounded up and forced into the vans, were gassed with carbon monoxide as the vehicles drove to nearby killing sites. As one Einsatzgruppe C member, SS-Obergruppenführer August Hafner, later recalled, "The screaming of the people in the gas vans was indescribable. I can still hear it today." One of the most haunting accounts of the Einsatzgruppen's crimes comes from the diary of Felix Landau, an Austrian SS officer who served with Einsatzgruppe C in Ukraine. In an entry dated July 12, 1941, Landau describes a mass killing in the town of Lutsk, writing, "The place was ideal for our purposes. It was a large sand pit, which provided a natural wall on one side. The firing squad was composed of 10 men. One after the other, the Jews had to lie down on top of those who had already been shot." Landau's chilling words serve as a stark reminder of the cold-blooded brutality of the Einsatzgruppen's actions. As he later wrote in another diary entry, "We're just doing our job, nothing more. We are soldiers who have to carry out every order unconditionally." As the war turned against Germany and the Soviet army began to push back the invaders, the Einsatzgruppen's killing operations became more frenzied and desperate. In the final months of the war, the killing squads murdered thousands of Jews and other prisoners in a last-ditch effort to cover up their crimes. In one particularly notorious incident, Einsatzgruppe D, under the command of SS-Gruppenführer Otto Ohlendorf, murdered over 1,000 Jewish children in the Crimean city of Kerch, burying them alive in a mass grave. As Ohlendorf himself later testified during his war crimes trial, "The children were thrown into the pit alive. The wailing was indescribable." Baltic blood, the Einsatzgruppen's reign of terror in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. As the Nazi war machine rolled across the borders of the Baltic states in the summer of 1941, a shadow of death and despair descended upon the lands of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The Einsatzgruppen, the notorious killing squads of the SS, followed closely behind the advancing German troops, their sinister purpose etched in the very marrow of their bones. These men, fueled by a twisted ideology of hate and a thirst for blood, would leave an indelible stain upon the pages of history, their crimes forever seared into the collective memory of the Baltic people. As SS Brigadeführer Franz Walter Stahlecker, commander of Einsatzgruppe A, would later boast in his infamous Jager report, "The goal of cleansing the Baltic states of Jews has been achieved. The number of Jews liquidated by Einsatzgruppe A in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia is 220,250. The first weeks of the German occupation saw a frenzy of violence and brutality unleashed upon the Jewish populations of the Baltic states. In Lithuania, the Einsatzgruppen found willing collaborators among the local nationalist groups who eagerly joined in the persecution and murder of their Jewish neighbors. On June 27, 1941, a mere 5 days after the German invasion, Einsatzgruppe A, under the command of SS Brigadeführer Franz Walter Stahlecker, orchestrated the infamous Kaunas pogrom. Over the course of several days, Lithuanian collaborators, urged on by the SS, murdered over 3,800 Jews in the streets and homes of Kaunas, setting a terrifying precedent for the atrocities to come. Among the victims was the renowned Jewish scholar and linguist, Dr. Daniel Persky, who was brutally beaten to death by a mob of Lithuanian nationalists as his wife and children were forced to watch. As the weeks turned into months, the Einsatzgruppen tightened their grip on the Baltic states, their killing operations becoming ever more organized and efficient. In Latvia, Einsatzgruppe A oversaw the establishment of the notorious Rumbula concentration camp, where tens of thousands of Jews from Riga and the surrounding areas were imprisoned and systematically murdered. On November 30th and December 8th, 1941, in what would become known as the Rumbula massacre, Einsatzgruppe A, along with Latvian collaborators, shot and killed over 25,000 Jews in the forests near the camp. The scene was one of unimaginable horror, with the sounds of gunfire and screams echoing through the trees as the bodies of men, women, and children fell into the mass graves. One survivor, Frida Michelson, later recalled, "I fell into the pit and was covered by the bodies of those who had been killed. I lay there for hours, pretending to be dead, until I could crawl out from under the corpses and escape into the forest." Estonia, too, felt the full force of the Einsatzgruppen's terror. Although the country's Jewish population was smaller than that of its Baltic neighbors, this did not spare them from the Nazis' genocidal campaign. In July 1941, Einsatzgruppe A, aided by Estonian collaborators, began rounding up and executing Jews, communists, and other perceived enemies of the Reich. One of the most notorious massacres took place in the town of Pärnu, where on July 16, 1941, Einsatzkommando 1A, under the command of SS-Obergruppenführer Martin Sandberger, murdered 214 Jews in a single day. The victims, including women and children, were forced to dig their own graves before being shot and buried in the sandy soil of the Baltic coast. Among the victims was the renowned Estonian Jewish artist Eduard Ole, who was executed alongside his wife and 2 young daughters. The Einsatzgruppen's reign of terror in the Baltic states reached its apogee in the latter half of 1941 as the Nazi killing machine kicked into high gear. In Lithuania, the 9th fort in Kaunas became a site of unimaginable horror as thousands of Jews were imprisoned, tortured, and murdered within its walls. On October 29, 1941, in what would become known as the Great Action, Einsatzkommando 3, under the command of SS-Standartenführer Karl Jaeger, massacred over 9,000 Jews in a single day, their bodies dumped into mass graves dug by Soviet prisoners of war. As Jaeger himself would later boast in his infamous report to Berlin, today's cleansing action in Kaunas was especially successful. The city is now free of Jews. The killing fields of Latvia and Estonia also bore witness to some of the Einsatzgruppen's most heinous crimes. In the Bikanieki forest near Riga, Einsatzgruppe A oversaw the murder of over 20,000 Jews between July and November 1941, their bodies hastily buried in a network of mass graves. Among the victims was Simon Dubnow, the renowned Jewish historian and philosopher, who was executed by the Einsatzgruppen on December 8, 1941. In his final moments, Dubnow is said to have cried out to his fellow Jews, "Write and record," urging them to bear witness to the horrors they had endured. In Estonia, the Kalevi concentration camp became a site of unimaginable suffering, as thousands of Jews and Soviet prisoners of war were starved, tortured, and executed by the Einsatzgruppen and their Estonian collaborators. Among the victims was the Jewish poet and playwright David Samoilov, who was imprisoned in the camp before being executed in September 1941. In a final act of defiance, Samoylov is said to have recited his own poetry to his fellow prisoners, urging them to hold fast to their humanity in the face of unimaginable cruelty. The horrors inflicted upon the Jewish populations of the Baltic states by the Einsatzgruppen are almost beyond comprehension. By the end of 1941, over 90% of Lithuanian Jews had been murdered, while in Latvia and Estonia, the Jewish communities had been all but annihilated. The toll of human suffering was staggering, with entire families and communities wiped out in a matter of months. As one survivor, Rachel Margolis, later recalled, "In the blink of an eye, everything was gone. My family, my friends, my entire world. The Einsatzgruppen took everything from us and left nothing but ashes and grief in their wake." Today, the memory of the Einsatzgruppen's victims lives on in the countless memorials and museums that dot the Baltic landscape, silent testaments to the lives that were so brutally cut short. In Lithuania, the Ninth Fort Museum stands as a powerful reminder of the atrocities committed within its walls, while in Latvia, the Rumbula Memorial pays tribute to the tens of thousands of Jews who were murdered in the forests near Riga, and in Estonia, the Kluga concentration camp has been transformed into a somber memorial, a place of remembrance and reflection for all those who visit. As the world looks back upon these dark days, it is important to remember the words of the British historian Sir Martin Gilbert, who wrote, "The Einsatzgruppen were the foot soldiers of the Holocaust, the men who carried out the first phase of the final solution with such ruthless efficiency. Their crimes in the Baltic states were a ghastly precursor to the horrors that would soon engulf all of Europe, a chilling reminder of the power of evil and the necessity of vigilance in the face of tyranny." The unwritten chapter, Einsatzgruppen's sinister designs on the Middle East and Britain. In the early years of the war, as the German Afrika Korps, under the command of General Erwin Rommel, pushed across North Africa, the Einsatzgruppen saw an opportunity to extend their murderous reach. SS-Sturmbannführer Walter Rauff, the head of the Einsatzgruppen's technical department and the mastermind behind the development of the notorious gas vans, was tasked with establishing a special unit known as Einsatzkommando Egypt. This unit, composed of experienced SS killers, was to follow in the wake of Rommel's advancing armies, with the goal of implementing the final solution in the conquered territories of the Middle East. Rauff's second-in-command, SS-Obergruppenführer Theodor Sevecka, was a veteran of the Einsatzgruppen's campaigns in the Soviet Union and had a reputation for ruthless efficiency. In a letter to his wife, dated June 1942, Sevecka wrote, "We are preparing for a great task in the Middle East. The Führer has entrusted us with the elimination of the Jewish race in this part of the world." Rauff's plan was as ambitious as it was chilling. In a memo dated July 1942, he outlined his vision for the mass extermination of the Jewish populations of Egypt, Palestine, and beyond. "The Einsatzkommando Egypt will be responsible for the immediate and complete elimination of all Jews in the territories under our control," he wrote. "This will be accomplished through the use of mobile gas chambers, which will allow us to carry out our task efficiently and discreetly." The gas vans, which had already proven their effectiveness in the killing fields of Eastern Europe, were to be shipped to North Africa and put to use in a new theatre of horror. Rauff's plans were meticulous and far-reaching. In a subsequent memo, he outlined the establishment of a network of concentration camps in the Sinai Peninsula and the Nile Delta, where Jews from across the Middle East would be interned and ultimately exterminated. As he put it, the final solution must be extended to the Middle East, and the Einsatzkommando Egypt will be the instrument of this sacred task. But Rauff's plans extended beyond the Middle East. He also envisioned a role for the Einsatzgruppen in the conquest of Britain, should Operation Sea Lion, the German plan for the invasion of the British Isles, come to fruition. In a chilling letter to SS Oberführer Dr. Franz Six, the head of the SS's Foreign Intelligence Service, Rauff wrote, "In the event of a successful invasion of England, it will be necessary to establish a special Einsatzgruppe to deal with the Jewish question on the island. This unit will be tasked with rounding up and eliminating all Jews, as well as any other elements deemed hostile to the Reich." Ralph's plans for Britain were as detailed as they were horrifying. In a subsequent report, he outlined the establishment of a network of killing centers across the country, modeled on the extermination camps of occupied Poland. The Einsatzgruppe England will be responsible for the elimination of at least 100,000 Jews on the island, he wrote. This will be accomplished through the use of mobile gas chambers and mass shootings, as well as the establishment of permanent extermination facilities. The prospect of the Einsatzgruppen operating on British soil was a terrifying one. Had the Germans succeeded in their invasion plans, it is not difficult to imagine the carnage that would have ensued. The Einsatzgruppen's tactics of mass murder and terror, honed in the killing fields of Eastern Europe, would have been brought to bear on the Jewish population of Britain, as well as anyone else who dared to resist the Nazi occupation. The plans were detailed and comprehensive. In a memo dated September 1940, SS-Obergruppenführer Dr. Walter Kunze, a senior Einsatzgruppen officer, wrote, "The conquest of England will provide us with an opportunity to solve the Jewish question in Western Europe once and for all. The Einsatzgruppe England will be the spearhead of this effort and will work closely with local collaborators to identify and eliminate all Jews on the island." Thankfully, these dark plans never came to pass. Rommel's advance in North Africa was halted at the Battle of El Alamein in late 1942, and the tide of the war began to turn against the Germans. The invasion of Britain, long a dream of Hitler's, remained just that, a dream. The Einsatzgruppen's designs on the Middle East and Britain were consigned to the dustbin of history, a chilling reminder of the depths of Nazi depravity and the scale of their ambitions. As Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself later admitted, the conquest of Egypt and the Middle East was a prerequisite for the final solution in this part of the world. Had we succeeded, the fate of the Jews in these lands would have been sealed. The Jaeger Report, a chilling chronicle of Einsatzgruppen atrocities. The Jaeger Report, a meticulously detailed account of the murderous activities of Einsatzkommando 3, a unit of the notorious Einsatzgruppen, stands as one of the most chilling and disturbing documents to emerge from the horrors of the Holocaust. The report, compiled by SS-Standartenführer Karl Jaeger, the commander of Einsatzkommando 3, covers the period from July 2nd to December 1st, 1941, and provides a cold clinical account of the unit's killing spree across Lithuania. The report was discovered by Soviet troops in 1944 and later used as evidence in the Nuremberg trials. As Benjamin Ferencz, a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, later remarked, "The Jaeger Report is a most precise and detailed account of the killings. It is one of the most important documents found after the war." Jaeger, a committed Nazi and a ruthless killer, began his career in the SS in the early 1930s. He quickly rose through the ranks, and by 1941 he had been appointed as the commander of Einsatzkommando 3, tasked with following the German army into Lithuania and carrying out the systematic extermination of the country's Jewish population. Jaeger took to his task with a zeal that was as efficient as it was chilling. Over the course of just 5 months, his unit murdered more than 137,000 people, most of them Jews, in a series of mass shootings and other atrocities that left entire communities decimated. The Jaeger Report, which was submitted to Jaeger's superiors in Berlin, provides a detailed breakdown of these killings, organized by date and location. The report is a model of bureaucratic efficiency, with each massacre listed in neat columns, along with the number of victims and the methods used to kill them. In one entry, dated August 6, 1941, Jaeger reports that his unit had murdered 3,200 Jews in the town of Rokiskis, using a combination of shooting and hand grenades. In another entry, dated October 4, 1941, he notes that 1,608 Jewish men, 1,571 Jewish women, and 1,469 Jewish children were killed in the town of Sveksna. The report also includes a summary of the total number of victims, broken down by gender and age. According to Jaeger's own tally, his unit had murdered 137,346 people, including 55,556 women and 34,464 children. The report also provides glimpses into the twisted mindset of the Einsatzgruppen killers. In one passage, Jaeger notes that his men had encountered a group of Jewish children who had been left behind during a previous massacre. Rather than sparing them, Jaeger ordered his men to kill them, writing, "As the children were running around unsupervised, I gave orders to shoot them, which was done." In another passage, he describes a mass shooting in the town of Kaunas, in which more than 10,000 Jews were killed over the course of 3 days. The shootings were carried out in an orderly fashion, he wrote. The victims were made to lie down in prepared ditches and shot in the back of the neck. The cold, clinical language used by Jaeger to describe these atrocities is a shocking reminder of the depths of Nazi indoctrination and the banality of evil. Perhaps most disturbingly, the Jaeger report reveals the extent to which the Einsatzgruppen's murderous activities had become routine. In one entry, Jaeger notes that his men had taken a break from their killing spree to celebrate Christmas, writing, "The Lithuanian partisans and some of our men celebrated Christmas Eve in the woods outside Vilnius." The idea that these killers could take a break from their genocidal campaign to celebrate a religious holiday is a chilling reminder of the depths of their indoctrination and the banality of their evil. As the historian Christopher Browning has written, the Jaeger report is a stark reminder of the human capacity for evil and the dangers of ideological fanaticism. It is a document that speaks to the darkest chapters of human history and the depths to which we can sink when we abandon our humanity. Justice on trial, the Einsatzgruppen in the dock. In the aftermath of World War II, as the world grappled with the horrors of the Holocaust, a series of trials were held to bring the perpetrators of some of the worst atrocities in human history to justice. Among these were the Einsatzgruppen trials, a series of military tribunals held in Nuremberg, Germany, between 1947 and 1948. These trials focused on the actions of the Einsatzgruppen, the notorious SS death squads that had followed the German army into the Soviet Union and carried out the systematic murder of over 1 million Jews, Roma, and other civilians. The Einsatzgruppen were responsible for some of the most heinous crimes of the war, including the massacre of over 33,000 Jews at Babi Yar in Ukraine in September 1941, and the murder of tens of thousands of civilians in the Rumbula forest near Riga, Latvia, in November and December of the same year. The Einsatzgruppen trials were a watershed moment in the history of international justice. They marked the first time that individuals were held accountable for crimes against humanity, and they set a precedent for the prosecution of war crimes and genocide that continues to this day. The trials were a massive undertaking, involving over 100 defendants and thousands of pages of evidence. They were also a test of the Allies' commitment to justice in the face of the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust. As the American prosecutor Telford Taylor later wrote, the Einsatzgruppen trials were a great moral challenge to the conscience of mankind. They posed the question of whether the rule of law could be applied to the most heinous crimes in history and whether the international community had the will and the means to bring the perpetrators to justice. The defendants in the Einsatzgruppen trials were some of the most notorious war criminals of the Nazi era. They included men like Otto Ohlendorf, the commander of Einsatzgruppe D, which had murdered over 90,000 people in Crimea, Ukraine, and Paul Blobel, the commander of Sonderkommando 4A, which had carried out the massacre of over 33,000 Jews at Babi Yar in Kiev. These men had overseen some of the worst atrocities of the war, and their crimes had been meticulously documented by the Einsatzgruppen themselves, who had kept detailed records of their killings. Other defendants included Werner Braune, the commander of Einsatzkommando 11B, which had carried out massacres in the Caucasus region, and Heinz Jost, the commander of Einsatzgruppe A, which had operated in the Baltic states and Belarus. The prosecution in the Einsatzgruppen trials was led by Benjamin Ferencz, a young Jewish lawyer who had served in the US Army during the war and had been tasked with investigating Nazi war crimes. Ferenc was a tireless advocate for justice, and he worked around the clock to build a case against the defendants. He had a wealth of evidence at his disposal, including the Einsatzgruppen's own records and the testimony of survivors and witnesses. One of the most important pieces of evidence was the so-called Einsatzgruppen reports, a series of detailed accounts of the death squad's activities that had been compiled by the SS and sent back to Berlin. These reports provided a chilling glimpse into the workings of the Nazi killing machine and helped to establish the guilt of the defendants beyond any doubt. One of the most powerful moments in the trials came when Ferenc presented the court with a map that had been created by the Einsatzgruppen themselves. The map showed the locations of mass graves across the Soviet Union, each one marked with a number indicating the number of people who had been killed there. As Ferenc later recalled, the map was a chilling reminder of the scale and brutality of the Einsatzgruppen's crimes. It was a visual representation of the Holocaust, and it left no doubt about the guilt of the defendants. Throughout the trials, the defendants maintained their innocence, arguing that they had simply been following orders and that they could not be held responsible for the actions of the Nazi regime as a whole. But the prosecution argued that the Einsatzgruppen had not been a rogue operation, but rather an integral part of the Nazi plan to exterminate the Jews of Europe. As Ferenc put it in his closing arguments, the Einsatzgruppen were not a bunch of crazy fanatics who went berserk in the East. They were part of a well-planned, well-organized program of genocide that was carried out with the full knowledge and approval of the highest authorities of the Nazi state. The prosecution also presented evidence of the defendants' own statements and actions, which showed that they had been fully aware of the criminal nature of their activities and had even taken pride in their role in the Holocaust. In the end, the Einsatzgruppen trials resulted in the conviction of 24 defendants, with 14 of them sentenced to death. The trials had a profound impact on international law and helped to establish the principle that individuals could be held accountable for crimes against humanity, even if they were acting under orders. They also helped to bring the horrors of the Holocaust to the attention of the world and to ensure that the victims of Nazi atrocities would not be forgotten. As the American judge Michael Musmano wrote in his judgment, the Einsatzgruppen were the first to carry out the final solution on a large scale. They were the vanguard of the Holocaust, the spearhead of the greatest crime in history. Their guilt is beyond question, and their punishment must be swift and certain. One of the most poignant moments in the trials came during the testimony of a survivor named Rivka Yoselewska. Yoselewska had been a young girl when the Einsatzgruppen had come to her village in Belarus and had watched as her family was murdered before her eyes. In a voice choked with emotion, she told the court, "I am not here for revenge. I'm here to bear witness. I'm here to tell the world what happened so that it may never happen again." The Einsatzgruppen trials were a crucial step in the long and difficult process of bringing the perpetrators of the Holocaust to justice. They helped to establish the principle that the international community had a responsibility to hold individuals accountable for crimes against humanity, and they paved the way for future trials of Nazi war criminals, such as the famous trial of Adolf Eichmann in Israel in 1961. Eichmann, who had been a key architect of the Holocaust, was captured by Israeli agents in Argentina in 1960 and brought to Jerusalem to stand trial. He was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death, becoming the only person ever to be executed by the State of Israel. As Benjamin Ferenc later wrote, the Einsatzgruppen trials were a reminder that the rule of law must always prevail over the rule of force. They showed that even the most powerful and ruthless individuals could be held accountable for their crimes, and that the international community had a responsibility to stand up for justice and human rights. Ferenc himself went on to become a champion of international law and human rights, helping to establish the International Criminal Court and advocating for the peaceful resolution of conflicts around the world. As we delve deeper into the abyss of the Einsatzgruppen's atrocities, we are left with a profound sense of horror and disbelief. The sheer scale of their crimes, the the cold-blooded efficiency with which they executed their monstrous mission, and the scars they left on the fabric of humanity are a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurks within the human soul. In the words of Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate, "For the dead and the living, we must bear witness. It is our duty to remember the victims, to honor their memory, and to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated." As we close this chapter of the diary of Julius Caesar, let us reflect on the lessons of the past and the importance of vigilance in the face of hatred and intolerance. For it is only by confronting the darkness head-on that we can hope to build a brighter, more compassionate future for all of humanity. Thank you for joining us on this harrowing journey through the shadows of history. Until next time, when we delve into another chapter of the human story, both tragic and triumphant.